The Game Boy Advance is probably one of the most versatile little consoles ever made. I mean, the variety of games, especially for a console that wasn't particularly powerful, is super impressive, and everyone obviously has their favourites. For me personally, it's Pokemon Emerald and Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. But you had so many great franchises on here: Wario Land, the Super Mario Advance series, the Mega Man Battle Network series, F-Zero games, and even the Mario Kart on this console, whilst not the best in the series, was pretty good. But honestly, outside of Mario Kart and F-Zero, I did not know much about racing games for the Game Boy Advance. So today I wanted to find out more and unearth some of those racing games that perhaps deserved a little bit more attention when they released. And in my humble opinion, I think I found some bangers for you guys today. There are some really cool looking games and some really technically impressive ones as well. So without further ado, let's jump into our first game, and that is Racing Gears Advance. So Racing Gears Advance released quite late into the console's lifespan, releasing in late 2004 and early 2005 depending on where you lived in the world, and the game was developed by Orbital Media. Now, at first glance, it actually looks like somebody shrunk an arcade racing game into a Game Boy cartridge, and somehow, in my opinion at least, nothing really was lost in that process. The game looks like a typical top-down racer, but once I actually started playing it, there was actually more to it than just top-down racing. The cars actually feel like they have weight, the drifting feels kind of controlled, and surprisingly the tracks are packed with detail. And on top of all that, the sense of speed is pretty impressive for the hardware. What makes the game stand out to me is just how polished it all feels. The handling lands in this perfect middle ground between arcade chaos and believable grip. You can slide around corners aggressively, bounce off rivals, and recover without the game turning into complete nonsense. It's fast, but it's readable, which is just perfect. What's even more surprising is the game features a variety of licensed cars, and each character has one licensed car that they drive throughout the game. So you've got the Corvette, the Dodge Viper, the Hummer H2, there's a few Lotus cars as well. There's a pretty cool variety here. Some of the character names are a bit stupid, don't get me wrong, we've got Jack, Speed and Throttle, but it's kind of funny. Another fantastic part of this game is the track design, because whilst there aren't a huge variety of environments, the tracks themselves have plenty of twists, turns, terrain changes and obstacles to navigate your way through, which helps keep things fresh, and on top of that there are also shortcuts littered throughout. And on top of this, you can also upgrade your cars as you progress through the game. So you can play through championships playing as different characters, obviously using their distinct car, and then you'll earn cash which you can use to upgrade your tyres, your engine and weapon storage, because yes, this is also a part combat game. The tyre upgrades are pretty good, as the game features a variety of terrain and weather across each track, so you can get snow tyres and dirt tyres, so on and so forth. The only slightly irritating thing is that when you purchase one of these upgrades, it is per racer, so if you wanted to fully upgrade all the cars in the game, you would have to do this 12 times. But hey, it's fun, so it's really not the end of the world. Impressively, the game also featured a 2 to 4 player multiplayer mode which you would play via the link cable, which is pretty cool. One other thing I do have to mention is just the cover of this game just screams like hell yeah. There's just a Dodge Viper with a missile flying past it. I mean, what's not to love? Anyway, so upon release, the game received some pretty positive review scores, with it currently holding 83 out of 100 on Metacritic. The user score is slightly lower with a 7.3 out of 10, but still pretty positive. Now, unfortunately, due to this releasing quite late into the console's lifespan, the sales for this game weren't exactly setting the world on fire. In fact, across both regions releases, so that's US and Europe, it sold 60,000 copies, approximately. Those stats, and all other stats I'll quote in this video, are from VG Charts. Now, before we move on to our next game, if you're a fan of retro games, racing games, or underrated games, then please consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. And if you want to come and talk about some pretty cool games and maybe win the occasional giveaway, then consider joining my Discord server using the link in the description below. Anyway, that's enough selling myself to you, let's move on to our next game. Okay, so moving away from cars just for a little bit, to focus on a different type of vehicle that I don't really talk about so much on the channel, mostly because I don't really know much about them, and that is bikes. So this is Moto Racer Advance. So this game was developed by Adeline Software International, maybe it's pronounced Adeline, I'm not really sure, but anyway it was published by Ubisoft and released across late 2002. I mean, before we even jump into the gameplay, look at the render distance, look how far ahead you can see in this Game Boy Advance racing game. That's insane. This game is all about pure arcade fun and speed. So you've got proper MotoGP Grand Prix, you've got motocross, and then you've got traffic racing as well. So the motocross is just absolutely fantastic. You've got some great jumps, some twists, some flat out sections. It's just so much fun, and some of the environments are just super creative, because at one point you're racing through a volcano that's erupting. I mean, what? It's just so cool. Then the Grand Prix mode is fun, and the traffic mode is also quite entertaining. The devs of this game clearly understood the limits and how the Game Boy Advance worked, because instead of chasing full 3D like some other racers did do on the console, it leaned heavily into sprite scaling and some really clever visual tricks to create this incredibly fluid kind of 3D effect. And it really works. As I said, the draw distance is surprisingly huge. Tracks rise and dip naturally, corners feel readable at high speed, which is insane for the console, and roadside objects whip past you with genuine intensity. As well as this, the game has a really great progression system, so instead of just handing everything to you at the start, you're constantly rewarded with new bikes, abilities, tracks, and upgrades, and it's surprisingly addictive. The game even shows you all the locked content ahead of time, which is kind of like taunting you to just keep going. So you will unlock motocross bikes through GP races, GP bikes through motocross events, and the game cleverly pushes you to experiment with every mode instead of just sticking to one style. And despite how fast everything moves and looks, the controls stay incredibly responsive. And honestly, I think that might be one of the game's biggest achievements. A lot of handheld racers from this era looked impressive in screenshots, but became nearly unplayable once the speed picked up. I'm looking at you, certain Need for Speed games. But Moto Racer Advance somehow avoids that entirely. The handling stays tight, the tracks still stay readable, and after a few races you start flowing through corners pretty much instinctively. It's one of these games where you can immediately tell the developers obsessed over making it feel good to play. Like, it just feels like they were passionate about it, which is fantastic. So in terms of critical response, this game has held up very well. It currently holds an 86 out of 100 on Metacritic. Unfortunately, it actually doesn't have enough user ratings to give it a user score, but there we go, that's why it's in this underrated racing games video. Now unfortunately, this game was only estimated to have sold about 10 to 20,000 copies. I'm not sure how accurate that actually is, but not great if it is true. Genuinely, if you haven't played this game before, I would highly recommend it. Even today, it still holds up, it's still a lot of fun, and it's definitely a great game that you can play on the go. Okay, so for our next game, I will admit I probably am a little bit biased just because it's one of my favourite game series ever. But I'm going to talk about it anyway. This is Banjo Pilot. Yes, Banjo-Kazooie. Now technically, Banjo Pilot probably shouldn't even exist, because this game had one of the weirdest development stories on the entire GBA. Originally it started life as Diddy Kong Pilot, which I guess would have been a kind of sequel to Diddy Kong Racing, which Banjo was already in, by the way. But if you know about Rare as a developer, you will know that they were acquired by Microsoft, so the game had to be completely reworked. So instead of Diddy Kong and friends, we ended up with Banjo characters flying tiny cartoon airplanes. And honestly, despite all the chaos behind the scenes, I'd say the game turned out surprisingly solid. At its core, this is absolutely a Mario Kart style racer, just with planes. It's got colourful tracks, item pickups, a kind of power slidey drift mechanic, some decent multiplayer, and just a lot of cartoon nonsense. Nothing here is reinventing the genre whatsoever, but that's kind of the charm. Banjo Pilot feels like one of those old school arcade racers that understands simplicity can still be fun. Anyway, so again, this was a game that released very late into the GBA lifespan, releasing in January and February of 2005. Of course, developed by Rare, this time was published by THQ. So yeah, obviously the big twist here is that you fly planes instead of driving carts, and while on paper that sounds like a really big gameplay shift, to be honest, it's kinda not. As I say, you can still drift around the corners, there's still weapons, you still lose momentum if you clip obstacles or rough terrain, which doesn't really make sense on the terrain front because you're above it anyway. The main difference is that you can kind of adjust your altitude during races, which means dodging hazards vertically and grabbing floating item pickups, which is kinda cool. It doesn't really transform the formula, but it's just enough variety to make the game a little bit different. Now in terms of visuals, this is probably my favourite part about it. It really leans into that classic, vibrant, Rare style. Everything also scales and rotates smoothly, almost like a souped up Super Nintendo racer. And it works really well on the GBA screen. The tracks are colourful, the environments are lively, and the game moves at a consistently smooth speed, even when races get chaotic. It definitely has that unmistakable Rare charm all over the presentation, the exaggerated character designs, the goofy sound effects, and the slightly weird energy to it. It feels like a handheld extension of that late 90s iconic Rare style. The game also has a decent amount of unlockable content here with new races, extra courses, and hidden bonuses, which will be enough to keep a completionist busy just for a little while. It's certainly not the longest game ever made, but it will keep you entertained for a few hours. Now, in terms of its critical response, Banjo Pilot was a little bit more divisive when it released. It currently holds a 68 out of 100 on Metacritic, putting it at the very top of the mixed to average zone. The user score is unfortunately lower, with a 5.9 out of 10 average. I personally think this game is a lot of fun and charming in short bursts, and especially if you're a Banjo fan, it's definitely worth checking out. The game also sold a fair bit better than the previous two games we've looked at, selling about 100,000 copies across America and Europe. Okay, so for our last game of the video, we're moving on to something a bit more realistic. Some would call this the GameBoy Advance version of Gran Turismo. This is GT Advance 3 Pro Concept Racing, or I guess you could call it GTA 3. No, that's going to be confusing. Anyway, this was developed by MTO and published by THQ, releasing firstly in Japan in April 2002, and then eventually making its way to America in February 2003, and finally here in Europe in May of that same year. So the GT Advance series had a reputation for aiming for a more realistic vibe than other Game Boy Advance racers, and it does manage that quite well. So instead of that cartoony chaos or exaggerated arcade action, the game somehow aimed for Gran Turismo but compressed onto a GBA. And by the time that GT Advance 3 rolled around, the formula had evolved into something genuinely impressive. What makes this game stand out to me is the handling. The first GT Advance leaned harder into realistic grip racing, and of course the second into rallying, and GT Advance 3 goes for a kind of middle ground. Don't get me wrong, you're still on roads racing and not dirt tracks, but the handling is looser, like how it was in the second game. Cars slide more, corners are a bit riskier, and long drifts suddenly become a major part of actually driving well. You've still got to manage your racing line, brake line, and corner entries, but you're now also fishtailing through sharp turns trying to carry speed without spinning. It creates a nice balance between sim-style structure and arcade-style momentum. And the amount of content here is absolutely insane for a GBA game. There are nearly 100 licensed cars included, with manufacturers like Honda, Subaru, Toyota, Nissan, so on, obviously a lot of Japanese car brands. And unlike a lot of handheld racers from the era, the cars don't actually feel like cosmetic swaps. Different vehicles genuinely handle differently. Some are heavier, some drift easier, some accelerate harder, and once you start adding upgrades through the tuning system, you can really customize how each car performs. Engine upgrades, suspension tuning, weight reduction, it's surprisingly in-depth for a portable racing game. The track design is also really cool. There are tight U-turns, S-curves, combination corners, and you've also got rainy weather and nighttime races that reduce visibility. The game actually expects you to learn the tracks instead of simply reacting to them. And now before entering new classes, you even have to pass license tests. which again feels very Gran Turismo inspired. It gives GTA 3 this sense of progression that a lot of GBA racers lacked. As well as working towards unlocking content, you're also working towards improving as a driver in the game, and having licenses to show for it. In terms of visuals, I think the game still holds up pretty well. It uses some really cool detailed sprites to create some fairly convincing 3D looking cars, and the camera sits slightly further back, making races feel faster and easier to read. The tracks aren't technically complex, but there's some clever environmental details like signs and roadside scenery and weather effects that kind of help sell the illusion that it is. The sound design's pretty good too, different cars have unique engine sounds, and the game even changes audio effects depending on whether you're skidding across pavement, gravel, or grass. It's subtle, but it adds a surprising amount of immersion. Though in terms of critical response, GT Advance 3 currently holds a 74 out of 100 on Metacritic, literally 1 point away from being in the positive review section, but that's fine. The user score is higher with 7.9 out of 10. The game was estimated to have sold approximately 80,000 copies, which is still not that many. Now if you were interested, the top 3 best-selling racing games for the Game Boy Advance is actually quite an interesting list. Of course, the number 1 was Mario Kart Super Circuit, selling just shy of 6 million units. But the next 2 actually surprised me. The second best-selling racing game for the Game Boy Advance is The Simpsons Road Rage, you know, the Crazy Taxi knockoff that was made. That sold about 1.2 million copies. And then the third best-selling game, literally right behind that with 1.13 million, was the Disney Pixar Cars movie tie-in game. And the GBA version was just a top-down racer, unlike the fantastic home console version. Anyway, that takes us to the end of our look at some underrated Game Boy Advance racing games. Are there any games that you'd like to see in a follow-up video for the GBA, or perhaps just some underrated GBA games in general? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thank you and goodbye.